Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad, and I am joined today by Mouin Rabbani, who will be the host or the guest for our 16th as well as 17th teach in happening today and tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Gaza time. And the title of the teach in is the Gaza War Chronicles. And we are delighted to have Mouin. I'll be introducing him in just a second. Let me just say that this is a collaborative teaching series with 22 other universities and research centers that we are very excited to be working with. And we will have a number of other events happening in the coming weeks. Not all teach-ins, but many will be. This particular teach-in is intended to be a conversation with Mouin about what are things like now and where they started. We're going to assume that somebody came from Mars and figured or witnessed this mayhem and destruction uh, and doesn't know anything. And Mu'in will tell us and tell them what actually happened. First of all, كيفك معين?
Bassam, it's very good to be with you. Mars or Uranus?
I think Mars. I'm not going to dignify that question. طيب, we are also very much looking forward to more episodes of Connections. I'll say something about that bio, where we will talk about your podcast and all the work that you do. Mu'in is literally indefatigable, and I will read a little bit about his background in work right now. Mu'in is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has, among other positions, previously served as principal political affairs officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, head of Middle East with the Marty Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, and senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliyya, where he also hosts the Connections podcast and edits its Quick Thoughts feature. He's also managing editor and associate editor of the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development and a contributing editor of Middle East Report. He is non-resident fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and at Democracy for the Arab World Now, a graduate of Tufts University and Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, where so many of us graduated in this particular network. Rabbani has published, presented, and commented widely on Middle East issues, including for most major print, television, and digital media. And this is something that I can definitely attest for, given I have actually witnessed Mu'in's rise over the decades. We will delve right into the subject matter. I just want to say before we start that just in the past 24 hours or so, 9 journalists were killed in Gaza by Israeli strikes, and that basically adds to the over 100 journalists so far. The number of injured as well as killed in Gaza is approaching 100,000, with 24,000 killed and 60,000 plus injured. And Israel has not been able to capture or kill one leader or high ranking member of Hamas. And most recently and disturbingly for those of us who are at university environments, since this teaching is intended to be a pedagogical tool, we saw the complete destruction and blowing up of the last remaining standing university in Gaza, Al-Isra University. And I would like to start by just showing this clip of this university being completely destroyed, and or at least shall we let's wait. I'll do it after your introduction, because it's something that has been circulating. It's quite disturbing, and in fact, you know what? Maybe I should start with
Good idea.
with that. Yeah. All right. So it's gonna be a silent film for a few seconds. It was surrounded. The bombs were planted carefully and slowly. This is certainly something that demonstrates that there were no threats coming from that building because of the time that it took to plant the explosives and so on and so forth. This is massively disturbing to anybody, including those of us who are in university settings. And this is simply another installment of the onslaught and slaughter that and destruction that we are witnessing. Muin, I would like us to start with a very basic introduction, as I shared something that you would share with the uh, people who have very little idea as to
Sure.
what happened. And I'll let you do the brief introduction, and then we will go into the topics of the day, which will include basically the history of Gaza, the history of Hamas and how it came to rule Gaza, the ICJ, and we will also talk about the destruction of the healthcare sector. We will leave, and we'll probably address Yemen, given it's in the
Yes.
news. We will leave some topics that are equally important and significant until tomorrow. So give us the rundown. What happened in the past 100
Hmm.
days?
Thank you, Bassam. Perhaps for those who, let's say, are unfamiliar with this topic, what happened on the 7th of October, 2023, when the current war started? Why? What are its repercussions? The Gaza Strip, an area of 365 square kilometers, is populated by 2.3 million Palestinians. About three-quarters are refugees, those ethnically cleansed in 1948 from what is now southern Israel, and their descendants. The Gaza Strip has been occupied by Israel since 1967. Since the early 2000s, it has also been under a suffocating Israeli blockade. Nothing enters, including from the border Gaza shares with Egypt, without Israel's approval. Israel also has full control over Gaza's airspace and territorial waters. Almost 2 decades of blockade have produced widespread poverty, malnutrition, and unemployment. As with similar sanctions regimes elsewhere, it has made the population ever more dependent on those that rule it. Hamas, in this case, the Palestinian movement that has ruled the territory since 2007. On the morning of the 7th of October 2023, at least 1,000 Palestinian guerrillas, primarily from Hamas, burst through the barrier encaging the Gaza Strip and simultaneously attacked multiple targets in southern Israel. Perceived until that time by Israel as a mediocre militia, primarily concerned with perpetuating its rule over the Gaza Strip, Hamas achieved total strategic and operational surprise. Within hours, the Gaza Division, the Israeli military force responsible for controlling the Gaza Strip, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Multiple intelligence facilities were overrun as well. By noon, the Palestinians had also seized control of multiple population centers in southern Israel, an area known as the Gaza envelope and larger than the Gaza Strip itself. It would take the Israeli military, which for decades assiduously cultivated an aura of invincibility, but had collapsed like a house of cards, several days to retake control of the Gaza envelope. The nature and scope of atrocities committed during this period, and atrocities there certainly were, remains fiercely contested. According to Israeli figures, more than 1,100 Israelis were killed, about two-thirds of them civilians. More perished at a rave held near the Gaza Strip than at any other location. It later emerged that nearly 200 bodies, burnt beyond recognition and initially assumed to be Israelis, in fact belonged to Palestinians. As indicated by Israeli press reports, Israeli helicopter pilots were ordered to implement the so called Hannibal Doctrine, which permits the killing of Israelis to prevent their capture. In another incident, 14 Israelis held hostage by Palestinian fighters in a house in a kibbutz were killed when an Israeli tank opened fire on the home in which they were being held in an attempt to force an end to negotiations. Many of the Israeli civilians were doubtlessly killed by Palestinian militants, and violations of the laws of war are a matter of record. At the same time, many of the macabre accounts circulated by Israeli and American officials, such as children being burnt in ovens, have been entirely disproven. President Biden repeatedly claimed to have seen images of infants being beheaded. The images, however, do not exist. Claims that Palestinians engaged in organized campaigns of sexual violence remain unproven and are still being investigated. Hamas, established during the late 1980s, grew in opposition to the 1993 Oslo Accords and on account of its prominent participation in the 2000-2005 Palestinian uprising and the failures of the Palestinian Authority. In 2006, it won parliamentary elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council, but increasingly bitter rivalry between Hamas and the Fatah movement, along with Israeli and Western opposition, prevented Hamas from governing. In 2007, inter-Palestinian tensions erupted into open conflict, and Hamas seized power in the Gaza Strip. In order to keep Gaza weak and Hamas off balance, Israel periodically launched military operations, such as in 2008, 2009, 2012, and 2014. In 2021, it was Hamas which initiated hostilities, and this time for reasons that had nothing to do with conditions in the Gaza Strip, but rather on account of growing Israeli incursions into the Haram al-Sharif in East Jerusalem and intensified Israeli settlement activity in Jerusalem. Previously known as the Forgotten Corner of Palestine, in recent years, all of Palestine had disappeared from the regional and international agenda. At the same time, ruled by increasingly extremist governments, Israel intensified its efforts to deepen and consolidate its apartheid system. The Palestinians' main objectives on 7 October was to irrevocably shatter the status quo. From their perspective, Israel had gone too far for too long and done so with total impunity. Confronted with slow death, they opted for a final roll of the dice in the hope of achieving a new lease on life. Putting an end to the blockade, forcing Israel into an exchange of captives, reversing the intensified assaults on Palestinian communities in the West Bank and on the Haram al-Sharif, and altering the strategic balance in a manner that would end the occupation were proclaimed as objectives. Israel, of course, saw things very differently. That same day, it commenced what is perhaps the most intensive bombing campaign in history. It also immediately tightened the blockade and transformed it into a full-scale siege to prevent the entry of food, water, fuel, and medical supplies into the Gaza Strip. Israeli leaders expressed an open desire to see the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip expelled to Egypt's Sinai Desert, the Sinai Peninsula. And Israel's systematic attacks upon civilian infrastructure, as we just saw with the Nusrat University, has been designed, and in many cases explicitly so, to make the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation. In late October, Israel commenced with a ground invasion of Gaza. Although indisputably the more powerful belligerent by orders of magnitude, it has, after more than 100 days, the longest Arab-Israeli war since 1948, failed to achieve significant military objectives, let alone a decisive outcome. As of mid-January 2024, Israel's onslaught on the Gaza Strip has killed more than 24,000 Palestinians, the overwhelming majority of them civilian non-combatants, with children accounting for approximately 40% of this total. Thousands more remain missing and presumed dead under the rubble, and more than 60,000 have been wounded. Multiple generations of entire families have been wiped out. A new acronym has entered the lexicon of conflict medicine as a result of this war: WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. The Israeli military has repeatedly ordered the civilian population to flee to designated safe zones, then bomb these locations. Snipers have shot dead civilians, as well as Israeli captives carrying white flags of surrender. Summary executions of unarmed civilians have been widely reported by journalists, and many of these journalists are no longer with us because more journalists and more UN staff have been killed in the Gaza Strip by Israel since October 2023 than in any other armed conflict on record. Civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, including the health and education sectors, and more than two-thirds of the housing stock, has been systematically razed to the ground or rendered useless. Agricultural lands have been systematically destroyed, and cemeteries even plowed open, scattering the remains of the dead. As a result of the siege, 80% of people worldwide currently experiencing conditions of famine, according to the UN, are located within the Gaza Strip. Infectious diseases such as hepatitis are spreading rapidly, and infants are dying of hypothermia. As a result of these and other realities, Israel's campaign against the Gaza Strip is now being contested as a case of genocide before the International Court of Justice. Israel, in other words, has placed a target not only on Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups, but on an entire society and is acting accordingly. At the same time, Israel has, from the outset, enjoyed the unqualified military, political, and diplomatic support of the West and of the United States and European Union in particular. Unprecedented levels of arms deliveries, vetoes at the United Nations Security Council, and other forms of support have proven indispensable to Israel's ability to continue its war and to continue it with such levels of intensity since last October. Within the region, a coalition known as the Axis of Resistance, as it calls itself, has taken up arms in support of the Palestinians. Continuous hostilities, still short of full scale war, along the Lebanese Israeli border transformed this into a regional crisis. Attacks have also been launched from or at Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Iran, and most recently Pakistan, not only by or at Israel, but also at U.S. forces stationed in the region. In January 2024, responding to Yemeni attacks on Red Sea shipping bound for Israel in support of the Palestinians, the US and UK chose to launch air raids on Yemen rather than produce a ceasefire in Gaza. The war, in other words, is now a full blown international crisis, with the possibilities of significantly more escalation increasing by the day.
Thank you very much, Mouin, for this comprehensive introduction, and I appreciate the fact that we were able to put all of this together in just a few minutes. It's something that actually we'd love to use to provide an introduction to not just what we're doing today and tomorrow, but also to the other teachings that we've had on almost every germane and significant topic, which we will keep on expanding. Um, let's start with a discussion about Gaza itself. A lot of people uh, don't realize specifically what Gaza is, even though the words and phrases that have been used include the notion that Gaza is an open air prison. Of course, it's contested by Israel. Everything about the Palestinian question is contested by Israel. But the idea that Gaza is an open air prison, how did it come about to be an open air prison? How did the past several decades, not just since 2007 when Hamas took over Gaza, but even prior? So if you can tell us about the history of Gaza.
Well, Gaza City itself is one of the oldest cities on earth. It sits at the crossroads between Africa and Asia, and has been an important transit route on trade routes since ancient times. The Gaza Strip, as such, did not come into existence until 1948. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution recommending the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, as a result of which significant parts of southern Palestine were allotted to the Arab state. But in the subsequent war, Israel managed to conquer 78% of what had previously been the British Mandate of Palestine, leaving only 22% in Arab hands. The vast majority of that came to constitute the West Bank, which was annexed by Jordan, and only 1% of the British Mandate, and a much smaller area of the Gaza, a much smaller area of southern Palestine than had been initially allotted to the Arab state, came to be known as the Gaza Strip. And it's called the Gaza Strip because of its shape on the map. That was, after 1948, controlled by Egypt. And Egypt, I think it's important to point out, did not annex the Gaza Strip or seek to administer it as Egyptian territory. Rather, it administered the Gaza Strip, in its words, as an integral part of Palestine. I think the other main thing to understand about what happened to the Gaza Strip in 1948 is that its population effectively tripled, if not more so, overnight. 200,000 Palestinians, those ethnically cleansed primarily from areas south of Jaffa in southern Palestine, and Bir Sabah, Bir Sheba, and areas west of it, were driven into the Gaza Strip, a territory that in 1947 had a population of 80,000 and suddenly had a population of, I think, 250,000 to 300,000. And it was in this environment, really, that the Gaza Strip has, I think, as we've previously discussed on one of these teach-ins, always played a primary role in the development of the Palestinian national movement since 1948. If we look, for example, at many of the key leaders of the movements that emerged during the 1950s and 1960s, people like Yasser Arafat, Salah Khalaf, uh, Abu Jihad, Khalil al-Wazir, and many others, they were in fact refugees in the Gaza Strip, or were from the Gaza Strip, or had some connection to the Gaza Strip at the beginning of their involvement in Palestinian politics and Palestinian militancy. I think another point that's worth pointing out that people often don't realize is that 1967 was not the first time that Israel occupied the Gaza Strip. The first occupation actually came in 1956 in the context of the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis developed when Egypt's leader, Jamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, basically took ownership of it away from the British and the French. And the British and the French, together with the Israelis, concocted a scheme known as a tripartite aggression, whereby Israel would launch a war and occupy the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and then the British and the French, on the pretext of ending these hostilities and peacekeeping, if you will, would invade the Suez Canal zone and use that as a foothold from which to overthrow the Egyptian regime of Jamal Abdel Nasser. And it was during this period that Israel, for 7 months, in fact, occupied the Gaza Strip. There were a whole series of massacres. I think the largest one was in Khan Yunis at that time. And then at the end, Israel, under international pressure, particularly from the Soviet Union and the United States, one of the rare occasions on which the superpowers had broad agreements on an international crisis, Israel was forced to withdraw from Sinai and the Gaza Strip. And it's interesting because at this point, David Ben Gurion, Israel's leader at the time, spoke about re-erecting the Kingdom of Solomon or something to that effect, and had clearly indicated that as far as Israel was concerned at the beginning of this war, um, the Gaza Strip would become part of Israel rather than an occupied territory. As part of that, the resolution of that war and crisis, the United Nations sent peacekeeping forces um, into along the Egyptian, Israeli, and Gaza Israeli border, and they were stationed, let's say, on the Arab sides of those borders. So now, if you go to the Gaza Strip, you will see certain areas that are known, for example, as Brazil Camp, Canada Camp, and others. And those are the areas in which those international forces had been stationed between 1956 and 1967. The next major development in this territory was, of course, 1967, where when Israel, during the June War, often known as the Six-Day War, seized control of and occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. And what's interesting here is that there was a further depopulation of these occupied territories immediately after, during, and immediately after the 1967 war. So if we go to the Syrian Golan Heights, for example, more than 90% of the Syrian population that was there on the 5th of June was gone by the end of the year, ethnically cleansed and expelled, and just as importantly, prevented from returning. In the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, over 250,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. And in fact, the population of the occupied Palestinian territories did not regain its 1967 levels until the early 1980s. And quite importantly, I think, are several issues here. First is that Israel, going back to the 1950s, had a key policy objective of seeking to reduce the population of the Gaza Strip, even before it occupied it. From Israel's perspective, it did not want this large agglomeration of refugees effectively living within walking distance of their former homes. It saw this as a constant threat to its security, as a cause for these people to constantly seek to reclaim their rights. And as far as Israel was concerned, the less Palestinians there were, particularly Palestinian refugees there were in the Gaza Strip, and the further away they were located from the Gaza Strip, the better. And Israel, over the years, had proposed numerous schemes and plans and initiatives to seek to move these people out of the Gaza Strip, whether to Egyptian Sinai, Libya, Iraq. At one point in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, in fact, Israel reached an agreement with the Stroessner regime in Paraguay. The Stroessner regime is one that was known to provide refuge to many Nazis after the Second World War. And the agreement reached was that Paraguay would accept 60,000 refugees from the Gaza Strip for permanent resettlement in Paraguay. And in exchange for that, the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, would do an audit of its budget and come to the conclusion that it no longer had the budget to search for Nazi fugitives in Paraguay. And so depopulation, I think, is one main theme that we've seen since 1967. The other, of course, is settlement. We quite rightly talk about the annexation of East Jerusalem and settlement activity in the West Bank, but what people often don't realize is that, in fact, one of the very first settlements to be established by Israel after 1967 was Kfar Darom, just outside Deir el-Balah in the Gaza Strip. And over the years, the Israelis built numerous settlements in the Gaza Strip. Gush Katif, which took much of the prime agricultural and beachfront land in the Gaza Strip. Netzarim, through which Israel was able to occupy a key transportation juncture between the northern and southern Gaza Strip, and of course others. And there was also, I think, significant economic changes as a result of the 1967 war. Israel imposed what's called an enforced common market on the occupied territories. And as part of this arrangement, um, laborers from the Gaza Strip began to work in Israel at the time, primarily in the construction industry and agriculture, in the textile industry, but at the same time, as Sarah Roy of Harvard University has pointed out so brilliantly, the overall economic policy of Israel towards the Gaza Strip was not one of development or underdevelopment, but rather one of de-development, of creating conditions so that any future economic development would no longer be possible in the Gaza Strip. As a result, of course, many Gazans ended up working as migrant workers, for example, in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, elsewhere, particularly after 1973, when these states all of a sudden had vastly increased revenues and income and needed a lot of workers, managers, laborers, and so on for their own development. This began to change during the 1980s. And um, two main developments, I think. One is that the Egyptian Israeli peace treaty of 1979, it had a general impact on the occupied territories in the sense that Egypt, Israel, and the United States, without Palestinian participation, agreed what was called the autonomy plan, whereby the military government, which had ruled these territories since 1967, acquired a civilian facade known as the civil administration. In practice, nothing changed, but it was more a change of form rather than substance. What did change in both form and substance is that in, in 1979, for the first time since 1948, you had a hard border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. Egypt insisted on retrieving every last square millimeter of Egyptian territory that had been occupied by Israel since 1967. And so, as a result, for example, Rafah, where it had grown westwards, and there were Canada Camp, which I just mentioned, for example, was located on the Egyptian side of Rafah, populated largely by Palestinians. These people were all of a sudden stuck on the Egyptian side of the border and wouldn't be able to return to the Gaza Strip until the 1990s. It was in fact in this context that the first tunnels between Egypt and the Gaza Strip were dug during the 1980s to allow Palestinians transit between these border zones. The next significant development is, of course, in 1987 with the Intifada, the popular uprising that encompassed the entirety of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that actually began in the Jadaliyya refugee camp in the Gaza Strip on account of what the Israelis claim is a traffic accident. What Palestinians insist was a deliberate ramming of a vehicle carrying Palestinian workers returning to the Gaza Strip from Israel, in which four were killed. And within days, of course, the entirety of the occupied territories um, was erupted in rebellion, a rebellion that would last until the Oslo agreements came around in 1993. And in 1993, pursuant to the Oslo agreements, the first area to achieve autonomy was actually the Gaza Strip. It was initially known as the Gaza Jericho First Plan, through which Israel redeployed, never withdrew. The term used was redeployment. It redeployed from around 60% of the Gaza Strip. It kept the settlements, it kept the military bases, it kept a buffer zone, which is now again being discussed. And it was in that context that the Palestinian Authority was first installed in the Gaza Strip, and first developed in the Gaza Strip, and for many years was actually strongest in the Gaza Strip. When Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader, returned to Palestine, he returned to Gaza City. Now, as many people know, the Oslo agreements were not only were on the one hand they were a great success in the sense that Israel entered this agreement in order to be able to perpetuate and consolidate its control over the Palestinians. But from a Palestinian perspective, for those, for example, who didn't read the accords or placed undue hopes of them on them, they were a political as well as economic failure. And by the end of the 1990s, the Palestinian Authority had become the largest employer in the Gaza Strip, so that more people were more dependent on income generated by employment in either the Palestinian civil service or security forces than any other source. In 2000, you had the eruption of the Second Intifada, and this was particularly intense in the Gaza Strip. And once again, as in the First Intifada, as through much of the occupation, the Gaza Strip once again functioned as a kind of human laboratory, if you will, for new technologies and new forms of repression that were being deployed by the Israeli military and intelligence forces. I should perhaps just backtrack very
Mm.
briefly to say that the most sustained rebellion after 1967 erupted in the Gaza Strip, where you had remnants of what was known as a Palestine Liberation Army. These were military units that were formally part of the PLO but operated under the command of the Egyptian military, along with the newly emergent Palestinian guerrilla organizations such as Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which had been particularly involved in this rebellion, and others, managed created a situation where, as Israeli military leaders put it, the Israelis controlled the towns and refugee camps of the Gaza Strip by day, and the guerrillas ruled them by night. And then Ariel Sharon, who was the military commander in charge of the Gaza Strip, um, raised entire neighborhoods in order to create these broad streets, particularly in Gaza's refugee camps, so that tanks could drive through them and maintain order and so on. I think it was a National Lawyers Guild that in the 1970s put out a book on Israel's methods of repression in the Gaza Strip, which is worth reading because, I mean, you have, nurses being stripped in public and being beaten by leather whips and all, kind of exactly what one would expect in a situation of colonial rule and colonial counterinsurgency. Throughout this period, Israel, the Gaza Strip, as a West Bank, it was not ruled by the Israeli government directly. It was ruled by something known as the military government. In other words, the Israeli government appointed a military officer who functioned effectively as the dictator of this area. He issued military orders, which had the force of law. He issued military orders about just about everything, and it would be, I think, not inappropriate to characterize Israeli rule in the Gaza Strip as a military dictatorship imposing totalitarian rule when you look at the things that were allowed, prohibited, controlled, regulated, and so on.
Wow, that's quite a bit, Muin. We could talk a lot more about the peculiarities
Mm-hmm.
of the development of Gaza, but we want to move next to the topic, everyone's favorite topic, especially Israel, and that is Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what can you tell us about Hamas, its development, what it is, and why are we in a situation right now where everything is being reduced to Hamas?
Yeah. Well, let me start by just making one more point about the Gaza Strip is that by the 1980s, the Gaza Strip had become one of perhaps the most densely populated area on Earth. And if you compare it to others, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, and so on, it was much more congested. It didn't have high-rise buildings and so on. And on top of that, some 40 to 60% of it was reserved for exclusive use by Israel settlers and settlements. In other words, these were areas where Palestinians could not build new homes, could not operate their businesses and build schools and infrastructure and so on. Um, the development of Hamas, I'll try to give the short version. Uh, Hamas emerged out of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a Islamist political movement that was initially founded in Egypt in 1928, which had two main objectives. One was a Islamization of Egyptian and later Arab society, and the other was resistance against colonial rule. Egypt at the time was under British domination, and and it had one of it had, I think, many characteristics in common with the other movement that was prominent at the time, which is a communist party, in the sense that it looked to grassroots popular mobilization. It practiced not only elite politics, but also popular politics. It engaged in social services and so on, and also began to establish national chapters throughout the region, in which the Egyptian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, given that that's where the movement was founded, and in many respects, in important respects, performed a role similar to that would be later performed by the Soviet Communist Party in relation to the various national chapters elsewhere. Um, Muslim Brotherhood was severely repressed by the Egyptians after the Free Officers Movement. Jamal Abdel Nasser and his colleagues seized power in 1952 and was severely repressed in the Gaza Strip during the 1950s and 1960s. In the West Bank, by contrast, the Muslim Brotherhood was pro-regime, supported the Jordanian monarchy against various challenges from either the left or pan-Arabist movements. And the Muslim Brotherhood in in Gaza and the West Bank operated separately as parts of two different national chapters. After 1967, this gradually began to change. But I think what is important to know about the Muslim Brotherhood in the occupied territories after 1967 is that it did not engage in active resistance against the Israeli occupation. And the reason it gave is that it was much more focused on its Islamization project, on making Palestinian society more pious and observant and so on. And it would make the argument, that Palestinian society needs to be properly Islamized in order to prepare itself for an eventual confrontation with Israel. And in this context, you had the rise of the PLO and of the Palestinian guerrilla movements. Israel demonstrated a clear preference as part of its divide and rule strategy for the quiescent policies and practices of the Muslim Brotherhood over the militant approach of the PLO factions and to a certain extent of the Palestine Communist Party as well. This began to change during the 1980s. Two developments. First development was that in 1981, 1982, a group of Muslim Brotherhood activists, also joined by a number of more, let's say, religiously inclined activists from the mainstream Fatah movement, established an organization known as Islamic Jihad, which still exists until today, influenced by the Islamic Revolution in Iran and by jihadist organizations in Egypt, which had been developing there initially under the sponsorship of the Sadat regime. They eventually assassinated him. This was a group that placed confrontation with Israel and armed revolution at the forefront rather than Islamization. And this, of course, presented a challenge to the Muslim Brotherhood because they were beginning to lose members to this more militant organization that, in effect, emerged out of its womb. The second main development, of course, was the eruption of the 1987 uprising, when when the Muslim Brotherhood, which by that time had merged the Gaza and West Bank chapters, could no longer credibly maintain the prioritization of its Islamization project at a time when Palestinian society from A to Z was engaging in open civil rebellion, popular rebellion against the Israeli occupation. Hamas likes to claim that it was established in 1987 prior to the eruption of the uprising and that it was a main instigator of that uprising. I don't find that version of events credible. I think Islamic Jihad did play an important catalytic role in that uprising, but Hamas, as far as I'm concerned, was established in early 1988 as a response to the challenge posed to it by the uprising. And so Hamas, you can look at it as a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, or you can look at it as the militant arm of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, because you still do have some members who are Muslim Brotherhood, but not Hamas. So I think it's important to recognize that Hamas was born in this context of rebellion and uprising as a response to that rebellion and uprising. And in fact, very quickly began to develop and to gain support at a time when the Palestinian leadership of the PLO, Yasser Arafat and others, were in the process of seeking a strategic agreement with Israel. So in 1988, you had November 1988, you had the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, which very clearly endorsed a two-state settlement to the question of Palestine. Then you had the recognition of Israel, the renunciation of armed force, and so on, resulting in 1993 in the Oslo Agreement, the Oslo Accords. In fact, most Palestinians in the occupied territories, and particularly in the Gaza Strip in September 1993, either supported the Oslo Agreement, given the exceptionally high levels and length of Israeli repression that they had been forced to endure, particularly since 1987, or took an agnostic attitude of, let's see what comes out of this. The widespread opposition to Oslo among Palestinians, I think at that time, was primarily based in exile rather than within the occupied territories. Nevertheless, Hamas during the 1990s managed to profit very substantially from the failures of Oslo and the growing public disenchantment with Oslo. It during this time also began to much more systematically develop its military wing, the Martyr Hazadin al-Qassam brigades. Um, and by the time that the second Palestinian uprising erupted in 2000, Hamas was poised to really make its mark on Palestinian society and in the context of the question of Palestine in ways that it hadn't before. Sure, it carried out a series of suicide bombings in the 1990s, and it had played its role previously. But during the 1990s, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, had in fact quite effectively repressed Hamas. But with the eruption of the second Intifada, all of a sudden Hamas had this freedom of action it had never enjoyed before. Hamas was actually a latecomer to the second Intifada, something many people don't know. And the reason is that Hamas initially perceived the second Intifada as something that Arafat and the Palestinian Authority had either instigated or had taken a hands off approach to in the hope of improving their negotiating position by Israel. And that as soon as Israel and the US responded positively, they would clamp down on it. And it was only after they felt confident that the Intifada would continue to develop and that the PA could no longer crush it, that they began to get actively involved and ended up taking the lead to the point where by the time Arafat had been removed from the scene, Abu Mazen replaced him, and in 2006, new Palestinian legislative elections were held. Hamas felt this was an opportune moment to translate its popular appeal into institutional power. And so Hamas, which in effect grew up in opposition to the Oslo agreements, ended up being their prime beneficiary in 2006 when it won the elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council held pursuant to the Oslo Accords, which it ostensibly rejected. Hamas never got a fair shake at governing. The PA tried to undermine it. Israel and the West placed all kinds of ideological litmus tests on it. There was an attempt to isolate and marginalize it. Ultimately, in 2007, Hamas launched what it calls a preemptive coup, a seizure of power, as a result of which it seized control of the Gaza Strip and has been ruling it ever since. I think Hamas rule has clearly been hegemonic and authoritarian. It has, under the circumstances, I think, also done reasonably well in being able to provide basic services to the population of the Gaza Strip at a time when you've had this increasingly suffocating economic blockade.
Should we give you like a water break?
As you wish.
Let me actually give you a water break while I share with people watching. Basically, let me do this so you can have a water break. While I share a couple of things here on the screen that actually are helpful in developing people's understanding of Gaza. There were two um, teachings that we did. The first one was by Shara Dumani, Ilana Feldman, and Shalin Sayali on the topic of Gaza in history, in which we addressed the history of Gaza way prior to where you, Mu'in, have discussed it here, because I think we went all the way back to the early to mid 20th century, and Ilana Feldman also continued this conversation and addressed various other topics, including more on the contemporary period. And of course, this session was moderated by the um, incomparable Shilin Sayali. Uh, Everyone was actually really interested in this expansive and somewhat comprehensive teaching on Gaza with PowerPoints and all the trappings. And I would like to simply share that this can be found as well as everything else that we have produced with the collaborators. Not always the best term to use, but with our co-organizers. Everything can be found on www. I don't know if anybody else says www anymore. I'm trying to give Moin some time to rest. So, PalestineInContext.org. So you can find everything, including the teaching, all the teachings, 16 so far, the podcast, War on Palestine, which chronicles very important moments in the assault on Gaza, produced by Noura Ariqat and Ziad Abu Rish and myself as the host. And you can also follow other events and lectures that we have been publishing on various topics, as well as a very expansive list of solidarity statements produced by um, dozens and dozens of organizations and education institutions and beyond. The second teaching that is very much in our sites that actually has been quite productive is Gaza and Geography by the rising scholars that everyone either knows or will know about, Noor Juda and Jihad Abu Salim. This was considered by many one of our better teachings because it was so meticulous, systematic, and these folks are either finishing their PhDs or recently minted PhDs, and the generalization is that they're a bit more systematic than some of the jaded people like myself and others. So I invite you to check out all of these teachings as well as others on Gaza in context or Palestine in context.org, and we will go back to Mu'in with our discussion on the other topics now. Let me share that our plan for today might be altered given that we spent correctly so a bit more time on the basics, but I'd like to move us to the ICJ, where we have tons of questions. Moin, you conducted four long podcasts at 8 p.m. before the ICJ, during the ICJ, and after the ICJ hearings with Norman Finkelstein. And these podcasts were viewed by tens of thousands of people every single day. And it was a very thorough treatment of what was happening in those sessions. So, can you, as a result of these conversations and your own research, can you share with us what are the details of the case at the International Court of Justice and why is it significant? Why should we pay attention given all the politicizing that is taking place? And are there similar cases that might indicate things about this particular case? And the final question, I'll let you go on without interrupting. How does this relate to the ICC, the International Criminal Court?
Well, let me first start by paying tribute to Norman Finkelstein. He has a global reputation as a thorough scholar and as one of the leading forensic scholars of our time, and he displayed that in spades over the course of 4 nights, of four very lengthy interviews on this ICJ case. He doesn't do anything halfway. He basically read every shred of paper that's available on this case by way of preparation, as he does with everything else, and as a result is able to come to very sound and well informed judgments. What happened at the International Court of Justice is that in late December, South Africa, pursuant to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, to which both South Africa and Israel are signatories, submitted an application to the International Court of Justice, asserting that there is a dispute between South Africa and Israel regarding what South Africa asserts is Israel's perpetration of the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. And in so doing, South Africa was not claiming to be a victim of Israeli genocide, but rather that South Africa, as a signatory to this convention, had a duty and an obligation to ensure that the convention is properly respected by all its other signatories, in this case, Israel. Um, and the first stage is an application for provisional measures, which means that South Africa was asking the court to specify a number of measures that would have to be taken by Israel and others to ensure that what South Africa claims is a genocide, that those actions do not cause further irreparable harm to the position of the Palestinians. Um, the International Court of Justice conducted hearings for 2 days. And the first day, South Africa presented its case, and during the second day, Israel presented its rebuttal. And I think it's important to note that at this stage, South Africa is not under an obligation to demonstrate to the court that to basically prove its case about genocide. What it has to do is persuade the court that it has a plausible case and that therefore a full and definitive hearing on genocide should be heard by the court. And if the court accepts that, it will then adopt provisional measures accordingly. So we then had the South African presentation, which in my view was just overwhelming, absolutely compelling, exhaustive. And as many people have pointed out, if you look, for example, at the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, you'll find many Holocaust deniers saying, well, there's no memo written by Hitler, build Auschwitz and gas the Jews or things of that sort, because for a very simple reason that most people who perpetrate genocide try to cover their tracks or try to do it implicitly and so on. Well, what was so striking in this case is the overwhelming number of explicit statements by Israeli political leaders, by Israeli military leaders, by prominent Israeli opinion makers, from the depth and breadth of Israeli society, basically calling for demanding, announcing crimes that clearly fall within the terms of the definition of genocide under the 1948 convention. And I think this is important because one thing that distinguishes genocide, it's not about how many people you kill or how you kill them. What is absolutely crucial and proving any case of genocide is being able to demonstrate intent. In other words, South Africa will have to convince the International Court of Justice that Israel's motivation was the destruction, in whole or in part, of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, and that there is no other plausible explanation for Israel's actions. And therefore, on the intent part, I think the overwhelming number of statements that South Africa was able to repeat from throughout the Israeli leadership and society, I found very compelling. What they also did extremely well was to draw a link between these statements of intent and the conduct of Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip. In other words, message sent, message received, message implemented. There was a team of I believe, 8 or 9 lawyers presenting various aspects of the case. Um, and it was just overwhelming. And then the next day, you had the Israeli rebuttal, which was along the lines of, well, he hit me first. Um, uh, you know, they made us do it. No, you don't understand the law. Actually, we didn't mean what we said, and those who meant what they said aren't really important. Um, Effectively didn't really manage to, or in many respects, didn't even try to rebut the presentation made by South Africa, but tried to do two things: try to delegitimize the South Africans along the lines of how dare they accuse us? We're the victims here. And secondly, even tried to argue that there isn't a dispute between South Africa and Israel under the Genocide Convention, and then tried to make various points about, tried to make various claims that somehow Israeli actions are legitimate self defense and so on. And of course, the key thing about genocide is there is no justification for genocide. Um, you can justify taking of a human life by claiming in front of a court that this other person presented an imminent threat to your own life, and the court will then not jail you for murder. But once it's established that you've committed genocide, there can be no justification for that crime. So, irrespective of what happened on October 7th, before then or thereafter, um, if Israel is found to have committed genocide, there will be no mitigating circumstances. Now, just to get back to this case, these hearings have been held. Um, the court is expected to announce its decision on the applicability of about whether it will continue with this case, because it recognizes that there is a dispute, and if so, what provisional measures it will announce, probably in the next week or two. And then the substantive part of the case begins, and that can go on for many years. I mean, to give one example, the one um, genocide hearing that the International Court has heard from start to finish, even though it was, in many respects, a much more complex one, concerned Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia and Montenegro. That began in 1993, and the final ruling was only issued in 2007. Another is Gambia versus Myanmar. That began in 2019 and is still ongoing, is not yet near a conclusion. But it's extraordinarily significant, I think, that at a time when you have all the main powers in the West lining up fully behind Israel, and basically giving every new air raid against the defenseless inhabitants, civilian population of the Gaza Strip, a standing ovation, that you have, I think, what many people throughout the world do see as the moral beacon of our times, South Africa, taking this case, taking this case to the International Court of Justice, where it was under no obligation to do so, where it did so against very substantial Western opposition. You know, you had the clueless airhead, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, getting up and saying this case is meritless. In other words, nothing even worth investigating. You had the Germans basically rushing to Israel's defense along the lines of we're the specialists in genocide. And if and if this was a genocide, we'd be the ones to determine that. And so, chapeau to South Africa for what it has done. How this case is going to end up is of course much more difficult to predict. And I think the Bosnia case, bearing in mind that Serbia had much fewer international allies than does Israel, the Bosnia case, I think, demonstrates how exceptionally high the bar is going to be in terms of getting a final judgment. I don't need to recount the Bosnian War. I think people are familiar with it. The numerous atrocities, concentration camps, mass rapes, and so on. Nevertheless, the International Court of Justice found that of all the actions and incidents relating to Bosnia placed before it, only the Srebrenica massacre of 1995 unequivocally qualified as an act of genocide. None of the others, according to the ICJ, merited the characterization of genocide. It did not make a determination that these weren't war crimes or crimes against humanity. Basically said those are things that are not adjudicated in the ICJ, but it found that only Srebrenica was an uncontested act of genocide by the Bosnian Serb forces. So it's going to, okay, it's a different world, it's a different court, but simply, I think to assume that you simply need to unleash an avalanche of evidence at The Hague to get a ruling that Israel is indeed guilty, I think underestimates the scope of the challenge.
When is the next juncture regarding the International Court of Justice decisions and?
Well, the next one, it's expected that within a week or two at most, and previous genocide cases, the court has been quite fairly quick in reaching a conclusion with respect to provisional measures. In other words, the court will give a judgment on three things. First of all, whether this case does indeed involve a dispute between South Africa and Israel. If it doesn't, end of story, it gets thrown out. And if it decides that a dispute does indeed exist, whether it will adjudicate this pursuant to the 1948 Genocide Convention. And I think it's fairly clear that if it's a yes on the first, it's a yes on the second. And then what, if any, provisional measures, think of it as an injunction, it will issue. And South Africa requested some very specific provisional measures. It wants the court to basically order Israel to observe a comprehensive ceasefire and various other activities. And here, if we go back to previous cases, the court hasn't done so. In the case of Bosnia and in the case of Myanmar, its provisional measures were fairly general in scope. It basically ordered those accused to prohibited them from engaging in any activities that violate the 1948 Genocide Convention, rather than announcing specific measures in terms of, you have to stop bombing the Gaza Strip and killing people. The exception is the most recent genocide case before this one that came to the court, and that's the Ukraine versus Russia. But that's a very different case because this wasn't Ukraine accusing Russia of genocide. This was Ukraine asserting that Russian accusations of genocide against Ukraine were being used as a justification for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that Therefore, the court should order Russia to cease military activities, which it did. So it's unclear what they're going to do, but assuming that they will accept the case and will announce at least some provisional measures, then let's say the real hearings begin, and those could take at least a year or two for statements to be delivered and so on, and then it'll be a very long slug.
Um, I'm sure we will return to this in due time. I'm assuming the timeline is end of January, early February. We'll hear more.
Yes, probably by the end of January.
And it coincides with the rumor, or maybe more than a rumor, that it coincides with the rumor that this is also the date that has been shared by the U.S. administration to Israel, that the hostilities at the level that they are proceeding right now should come to an end.
Yes.
Or a transition to the next phase.
Yes, and I've seen those reports as well. I have no reason to doubt the accuracy of those reports. What I think we need to bear in mind is U.S.-Israeli policy differences are common. Israel ignoring those differences is just as common, because Israel has the confidence that it can do as it pleases without facing consequences from the U.S. In other words, the U.S. will make its preferences to Israel known, will even make them crystal clear. And if Israel decides to ignore them, the U.S. won't do anything. Will it, in this case, impose any consequences on Israel for wanting it to wind down hostilities or reduce them? I don't see it. I mean, as many people have noted, we are now dealing with the most pro-Israeli U.S. administration in history. In many respects, even more pro-Israel than Israel itself. You have a U.S. president who openly declares that he is a Zionist. You have a U.S. leadership that has shown itself unconditionally committed to Israel's war aims and objectives. You have an administration that has, on multiple occasions, gone around Congress in order to be able to ramp up arms deliveries to Israel. So it stretches credulity to think that on the one hand, the U.S. is giving Israel everything it wants and everything it needs, while at the same time that Israel is going to be in any way responsive to U.S. preferences that contradict what Israel wants or intends to do.
I will deliberately not continue this particular conversation because it will get into speculation and some polemics, which I would like us to avoid, as we had discussed in this particular teaching. I would like to move to the what seems to be the last topic of today.
Should we talk about the ICC now, or would you prefer to
We can
move to
maybe
Yemen?
we can come back to the
Okay,
ICC
sure.
because it's a whole thing, and I
Yes.
know that you have written on the topic on Jadaliyya and elsewhere. So I would like us to move to the last segment, which is how Israel has so far destroyed the health sector in Gaza.
Yeah.
Based on the pretext justification that Hamas is resorting to hospitals. And the now commonly used description is actually quite apt, and that is how Israel moved from being outraged at being accused of bombing a hospital, Al Ahli hospital, to bombing every other hospital in Gaza. Can you tell us a little bit about this issue? Because it is perhaps one of the topics that will live with us for a very long time, even if the bombing stops, even if the slaughter stops, because of the absence of medical care for those who are inevitably going to need it
Yes.
as disease spreads and so on.
Well, that's certainly one important aspect. Look, I'd like to start by saying I'm sure bombs in medical facilities have been either hit or deliberately targeted in previous armed conflicts, but I'm not aware of any other conflict where an entire health sector has been targeted for destruction the way we've seen here. And second preliminary observation is that if you look at Israeli policy over the decades, it's not the kind of state that simply rushes into something when it feels that it might not be accepted by its allies or internationally. It will take a partial measure or conduct a particular act. It will see what kind of response it gets. And if there's either support or no response or limited opposition, then it will proceed further. And that's what we've seen here. The first attack, Al Shifa Hospital, the main hospital in the Gaza Strip, is the one that quite rightly most of the attention in recent months. But the first attack was actually on Al Ahli Baptist Hospital. I forget its full name, and this is a hospital that has organic links with the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and as some people have suggested, um, that hospital was not hit despite those links, but because of those links, because it allowed Israel to gauge international reaction to its attack on a health facility much more than if it had just hit any other Palestinian hospital. Now, what happened, the data escapes me for a moment, is there was a missile attack on Al Ahli Hospital. It produced hundreds of casualties. And shortly thereafter, Israel began making claims that, in fact, the hospital had been hit by an errant Palestinian missile. And this account was dutifully repeated by the Americans, who once again claimed they had independent intelligence reaching the same conclusion. It's an argument that never made sense because, as some have pointed out, these Palestinian missiles are quite rudimentary, and almost the only way you can be killed by a Palestinian missile is if it hits you on the forehead. Yet, in this particular case, we're to believe that hundreds of people were killed by a single errant missile. Now, I think it's important to recognize Israel's objective with its counter narrative about Al Ahli Hospital was not to seek to prove that it was a Palestinian. It was simply to sow sufficient doubt about who was behind this attack so that Israel would not be clearly held responsible. And in that, they succeeded. People either came out in support of the Israeli version of events or threw up their hands and said, we're not on the ground. We're not in a position to know. We'll have to investigate this after the war. And then, unfortunately, even Human Rights Watch came out with a report that I suspect it's going to retract before too long, also sowing further doubt about who was responsible for that. But I think, you had the Archbishop of Canterbury, also the head of the Church of England, refusing to come out with a clear statement. And as a result, it cleared the path for further Israeli assaults on the Palestinian health sector. I think Israel could confidently conclude that if it got away with bombing Al Ahli Hospital, then it wasn't going to be stopped with anything else. So the next step, the main hospital in the Gaza Strip, Al Shifa, began to be presented as this kind of Palestinian Pentagon. That all of Israel's war objectives, the Hamas leadership, its missile arsenal, its Iraqi WMD, and all the rest of it was all located beneath Al Shifa Hospital. And Israel didn't simply, you know, um, drop 2,000 pounds explosives on this hospital or immediately launch an attack. It approached it quite gradually, I would say. And every step of the way, there was insufficient opposition to what it was doing to force it to stop or withdraw. So that Israel eventually occupied Al Shifa Hospital, destroyed Al Shifa Hospital, put it out of commission, and as expected, and as was demonstrated, I think, in a very detailed investigation by the Washington Post, didn't deliver the goods. It didn't deliver the goods because there was nothing there, and it knew there was nothing there because its target was not the Hamas leadership that was never beneath Al Shifa Hospital. Its target was Al Shifa Hospital because it was a hospital. Um, and we have seen the systematic destruction of the health sector in the northern Gaza Strip, and now more or less in the Gaza Strip as a whole. There are very few functioning hospitals left. Now, there is a physical destruction aspect. Another aspect, of course, is the absence of medical supplies, of fuels for generators, of vaccines for infants and children. Um, you now have large numbers of people dying from wounds and injuries that would normally be treatable because the medical sector does not have the equipment or capacity to deal with this. You now have cancer patients who are not receiving any treatment. You now have, for example, Gaza has a quite high proportion of diabetics. You now have people who no longer have access to insulin. You have people with other chronic conditions, whether it's high blood pressure or whatever, who no longer have regular access to the medicines they need to either keep these conditions in check or to stay alive. And of course, because of also the interdiction of the water supply and the absence of potable water, you now have the spread of infectious diseases like hepatitis and gastro, whatever they call the stomach infections and so on, which are extracting a particularly high toll among the very young and the very old who have weaker immune systems than the general population. So I think it's important to note that this attack on the health sector and its destruction operates at multiple levels, as you pointed out, not only in its direct impact, but also in its indirect impact and its longer term repercussions among a population that now has access only to the very minimal levels of healthcare that is required to survive. And I am sure this will also play an important part in South Africa's presentation to the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of perpetrating genocide in the Gaza Strip.
هلكتك.
لا بالعكس.
Uh, we're not using code words in Arabic. I simply said I exhausted you, and you said no to the contrary.
Yes.
بس حتى ما يصير في مشاكل. Mouin, that was really insightful. There are tons of comments on various platforms. There are tons of questions. We apologize. There's no way to get to all of them. It's been already 90 minutes, which is the limit that I suggested, because we have another 90 minutes tomorrow.
We do.
And at the same time, we need to cover all the rest of the topics, including the developments in the Red Sea and how it relates to the war in Gaza. We will also talk about the ICC. We're going to talk about Zionism, anti-Semitism, and various other developments in the region, as well as in Gaza. So I think we will leave it at that today.
Yes, I do need to make one comment of something I realize I neglected to point out. If I
Mm,
could do so very briefly, um, it's important to note that part of what made the current situation possible and Hamas rule in Gaza possible and so on was the Israel's disengagement, unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip
which is
in 2005.
actually one of the questions,
Ah, so we did answer a
saying,
question.
well, actually, we did, and
Mm,
I think we can end with that
mm,
in a few minutes.
yeah.
Uh, the question was exactly what you said, something that is used over and over
Mm-hmm.
to rebut claims about military occupation in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure how anyone who knows anything about
Yeah.
politics and geography and military occupation would advance this argument. But I'll let you conclude with this, and
Yes.
then I'll make the
Okay.
final conclusion.
Well, in 2004, Israel, under the leadership of Ariel Sharon, for reasons I won't get into here for the sake of brevity, announced that it intended to unilaterally disengage from the Gaza Strip. It didn't say it intended to end its occupation, but to unilaterally disengage. It deliberately, as a matter of policy, refused, despite even American requests, refused to coordinate its disengagement with the Palestinian Authority. And at the time, you had Israeli leaders openly speaking about it, ultimately resulting in what they called a Fatahstan in the West Bank and a Hamastan in the Gaza Strip, which is, of course, exactly what happened. Israel dismantled and withdrew its military bases and settlements from the Gaza Strip, but continued, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross and others, who are the ones charged by the international community with interpreting these matters, it continued, for all intents and purposes, or formally, to be the occupying power in the Gaza Strip. Because the criteria for occupation is not if you have civilian settlements or military bases in that territory. The criteria is whether or not you exercise effective control over that territory. And the answer to that is yes, most definitely, because Israel still controls the borders, the territorial waters, the airspace, the electromagnetic sphere, and also Israel has very much influence on how the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt operates. So the answer to that is yes, Israel did redeploy, and yes, Israel remains the occupying power in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you, Moeen. We will continue tomorrow. There are actually, I was going to ask you and bring us back to this question tomorrow, as well as a few other questions that have been repeated and that I'd like to ask. But as I promised you, I don't want to move into the uh, speculative, polemical direction, which in any case is sometimes equally as important, but not at this moment. Perhaps tomorrow, after we address the other topics, we can have some room for
Sure.
questions, and I will ask folks to send their questions on primarily YouTube with the word question up front so that we could collect them and do what we can. Perhaps the last half an hour, I'll give you coffee or other illegal drugs that will keep you with us for
Do
longer.
I have to choose?
No, I'll take care of
Okay,
it. مش
great.
مشكلة. And let me just say that we have been working on segmenting and curating a lot of these teachings, cutting out some of the fat like this fat that I'm talking, not this fat, but the discursive fat, so that we can actually make various interventions and segments of these teachings available for educators, whereby they could go to the website and select what they need based on the times they have or the amount of time they have. And we will do that. We also want to thank all of our co-organizers. I'm not going to list them, but you can find them all on every page at the bottom of PalestinianContext.org. And to thank everybody that participated, and today to thank you, Mouin Rabbani.
And to thank you, Bassam, for organizing this and managing it
It's a group
so
effort.
exceptionally well. Yes, it is.
It's a group effort.
But you're leading the group.
I just have these. We just have this equipment at the ASI, and I also have to say, I have to plug something that we're doing in literally 20 minutes, which is our emergency teaching series with Adil Iskandar and Sinan Antoun and myself. This series is satirical, and it is in its sixth installment today. And the title today, interestingly, is "What is and who is and is not Hamas?"
And if I may, I think these teach-ins are probably the best source of credible, factual information and analysis that I've yet seen on the Gaza conflict.
So join us on this particular same channel on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, Jadaliyya, and hopefully we will be able to provide some lightness. Of course, satire is satire, so not everybody's gonna love it the same way or like it at all. But that's the point. طيب, any last words before we release you?
No, just to thank you once again for organizing this, and very much looking forward to continuing our discussion tomorrow.
حبيبي, شكرا كتير. Thank you very much, Mouin, for your generosity and your indefatigable feature trait, characteristic, which is evident in your work on the Connections podcast, which is in what episode right now?
I think 89 will be coming up this Wednesday, with Hassan Ayoub of Al-Najah University, looking at the current situation in the West Bank.
And the last one actually is very important. Do you want to say something about it with Amal Saad?
Amal Saad was actually 2 weeks ago.
The one before.
Before the series I did with Norman Finkelstein. And that was, I think, also an outstanding discussion. Amal Saad is a leading authority on Hezbollah. And with her, we discussed the eruption of conflict along the Lebanese-Israeli border and broader questions relating to the axis of resistance.
Wonderful. And I also want to point people's attention to your ongoing Quick Thoughts post on Jadaliyya, which now is dozens of pages long, addressing various junctures in a manner that's basically inspired this conversation. So this is also a very important series of writings that you have started on Twitter, and then we coerced you into developing into a written post. So these are all very valuable extensions of these conversations, or a source of these conversations. So thank you so much, Mouin.
Thank you, Bassam.
And thanks to everybody for joining us. And we'll see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. EST, 8 p.m. Gaza time, or Gaza. And we will be continuing this conversation. Salam.